From his earliest years, Carlo Acutis showed a unique sensitivity that caught everyone's attention. He wasn't just another child running through the hallways at home. There was something in his eyes, a natural kindness that shone through his smallest daily actions. When he saw a beggar on the street, Carlo never just walked by. He would stop, look with compassion, and ask his parents to help. It was as if he carried within himself a moral compass that always pointed toward the good of others. His generosity wasn't forced, nor taught through long lessons. It simply flowed from his heart. At home, this spirituality was nurtured in simple ways: prayers before meals, conversations about faith during family walks, and an atmosphere where love for Jesus Christ was the natural bond in their relationships. Technology, which for many young people is only a distraction, became for Carlo a tool of evangelization. His humility was striking, even to seasoned adults. Though he grew up surrounded by modern comforts and had access to the latest technology, he never boasted or acted superior. Quite the opposite. He treated the doorman with the same respect he showed his most important teachers. His simplicity appeared in the clothes he wore, always preferring comfort over display, and in the way he welcomed classmates from every social background. During Bible studies at home, Carlo asked questions so deep they surprised his parents. It wasn't unusual to find him tidying up the house or paying attention to details other children would ignore. His pure heart showed itself in his readiness to forgive and in his habit of seeing the best in others. For Carlo, holiness wasn't some far-off goal. It was something to be lived here and now, in the ordinary life of a child. Carlo's devotion to the Eucharist began early and became the center of his spiritual existence. When he received his first communion at 7, something extraordinary was lit within him, a flame that would never go out. From then on, Mass was no longer a family obligation, but the most anticipated part of his day. He arrived at church with a joy that was contagious, and during the consecration his face seemed to shine in a way that even seasoned priests found moving. The rosary became his constant companion. He carried it everywhere, to school, on walks, wherever he went. For him it wasn't mechanical prayer, but an intimate conversation with the Virgin Mary, as if speaking to a loving mother. His devotion at Mass didn't go unnoticed by the older parishioners, who often commented on this young boy who prayed with such fervor. Carlo made worship feel natural and joyful, showing that faith doesn't have to be heavy or boring for the young. What made him truly exceptional was his vision for using the Internet as a spiritual tool. While most of his peers focused on games and entertainment, Carlo saw digital technology as a unique chance to evangelize. He created a website dedicated to Eucharistic miracles, researching cases worldwide and documenting each one with both scientific precision and unshakable faith. It wasn't just a pastime, it was his mission. He spent hours studying these miracles, speaking with experts, and organizing the information so anyone could understand. His method was careful, first checking the historical truth, then explaining the spiritual meaning. The site became an international reference, visited by people everywhere seeking to strengthen their faith through these wonders. Carlo proved it was possible to be a genuine Christian youth without abandoning modern life, using the Internet not only for fun but for spreading the gospel. The impact of Carlo Acutis continues to grow today, inspiring countless young Christians to rethink how they engage with both technology and faith. Youth movements around the world have taken him as a model of modern holiness, forming Bible study groups that unite tradition and innovation. Pilgrimages to his tomb in Assisi increase each year, with young people from every continent seeking to live their faith with the same authenticity. Digital projects for evangelization, prayer apps, online platforms documenting miracles, multiply, fueled by his pioneering example. His life speaks directly against the superficial culture of today, showing that eternal purpose can be sought even in a world full of distractions. Preachers and pastors often use his story to show how young people can use social media for good. Carlo's witness proves that sainthood is not locked away in the past. It can blossom in the digital age, transforming hearts and inspiring deep change in how we live our faith in the 21st century. Carlo's spiritual connection with Saint Francis of Assisi revealed a maturity far beyond his years. This wasn't a shallow admiration for inspiring stories, Something deeper was taking root in his heart. When his parents asked why he felt so drawn to Francis, Carlo's reply was disarmingly simple: he loved Jesus for real, the way I want to love him. His identification was so sincere that, even as a child, he asked to be buried in Assisi, the saint city. It wasn't a childish whim, but a decision formed in prayer and reflection. His devotion to Francis showed in his love for the poor, his simplicity of life, and his deep connection with the beauty of God's creation. On family walks, Carlo would often stop to look at a bird or a flower, whispering small prayers of gratitude. The Franciscan spirit shaped how he saw the world, turning everyday moments into opportunities for praise. It was as though he carried within himself the spiritual DNA of the Poverello, living with the same joy and simplicity of the gospel. At 7 years old, one event forever transformed Carlo's spiritual journey: his first communion. On that day, something remarkable happened. The Eucharist wasn't just received, it became the heartbeat of his whole existence. His parents noticed that from then on, Carlo rearranged his life to attend daily Massachusetts. He woke up earlier, organized his school schedule, and asked to be taken to church whenever possible. During the consecration, his face radiated a light that even experienced priests found unforgettable. This devotion wasn't imposed by his family, it flowed naturally from his heart, burning with love for Jesus. The change was visible. Carlo began to speak of Christ with a natural ease, as if talking about his best friend. His religion teachers marveled at the depth of his questions. The Eucharist became his daily strength, his source of joy, and the reason each day was worth living. It was impossible to separate Carlo from his sacramental devotion. They had become one and the same. It was during this transformative period that he discovered the story of Saint Gemma Galgani, who died in 1903, and immediately felt a deep spiritual bond with her. It was no coincidence he was drawn to her. Both shared the same burning passion for Jesus in the Eucharist as the absolute center of their lives. When his parents told him about Gemma's life, Carlo listened to every detail with striking attentiveness, asking questions that revealed a spiritual understanding far beyond his age. He learned she had lived an intense mystical union with Christ, experiencing extraordinary phenomena such as the stigmata and mystical ecstasies. What impressed him most, however, was not the supernatural, but the way Gemma transformed her suffering into an offering of love. Carlo began studying her biography with the dedication of a true devotee, memorizing her prayers and seeking to imitate her simplicity and purity of heart. To him, Saint Gemma represented the perfect model of how a young soul could give itself completely to Jesus, living each moment as an act of adoration. His devotion grew day by day, fueled by a spiritual thirst that amazed everyone around him. The decision to make a pilgrimage to Saint Gemma's home in Lucca marked a turning point in the spiritual life of Carlo and his family. When he expressed this desire to his parents, they first thought it was just a passing phase of childhood. But Carlo's respectful persistence and the seriousness with which he spoke about the pilgrimage convinced them that something much deeper was behind his request. The journey to Lucca became a true act of faith for the whole family, who discovered in the Giannini house a place of profound spirituality and devotion. It was here that Gemma had been welcomed as the 11th daughter, and where she lived her final years in deep mystical union with Christ. During the visit, Carlo remained in contemplative silence, as if absorbing every detail of that sacred place. He walked through the rooms where Saint Gemma had prayed, suffered, and experienced heavenly visions, showing a reverence remarkable for his age. The caretakers of the house were struck by his spiritual maturity, as he asked profound questions about her life. The experience was so powerful that Carlo told his parents he felt as though Saint Gemma was truly present, interceding for every pilgrim who came seeking her protection and example. On August 6, 1998, at only 7 years old, Carlo Acutis wrote in the Giannini House Pilgrim's Diary a letter that still sends shivers today for its prophetic depth. The words were simple, written in the uncertain handwriting of a child, yet filled with meaning we can only fully grasp now. As you can see, I let myself be guided by you. I am afraid, but fear will not stop me. But you walked close to me with Padre Pio. I love you very much. Carlo. It was as though this boy of 7 already carried a supernatural intuition of the trials he would one day face in his short earthly life. The fear, he mentioned, was not the ordinary fear of children. It spoke of something far deeper, as though he sensed his life would be marked by special sufferings. Yet his unshakable faith shone through every word. Even afraid, he would allow himself to be guided by the saints he so deeply loved. His mention of Padre Pio alongside Gemma revealed his early grasp of the communion of saints, companions walking with us on our journey to eternity. That simple letter would later stand as a prophetic witness of the heroic faith Carlo would display in the face of illness. The sudden leukemia that struck Carlo Acutis came like a lightning bolt out of a clear sky, completely overturning the life of a family that had been living happy and hope-filled days. In just a matter of days, that vibrant, energetic teenager began showing symptoms that at first seemed no more than tiredness or a mild flu. His parents, like any loving family, took him to the doctor expecting to hear it was something minor, perhaps too many activities, or simply the change of seasons. But the tests revealed a devastating reality. Carlo was facing one of the most aggressive forms of cancer known, a disease that spreads rapidly and defies even the most advanced treatments. The news struck the family like a bomb, yet Carlo, astonishingly, received the diagnosis with a serenity that left doctors and nurses unsettled. There was no despair, no rebellion, no bitter questioning of why this was happening to him. Instead, he displayed a spiritual maturity that impressed every medical professional who cared for him. From the very beginning, it was clear this would not be an ordinary battle against illness. It would become an extraordinary testimony of faith in the midst of the deepest suffering. The swift and painful advance of leukemia tested not only Carlo's physical endurance, but more importantly, the authenticity of his devotion. What amazed doctors, nurses, and his family most was the way Carlo treated each day of treatment as an opportunity to offer his suffering for the universal church. When the pain intensified during chemotherapy sessions, he didn't complain or ask to stop. On the contrary, he whispered prayers, offering his suffering for the Pope, for priests, and for all believers around the world. In one conversation with his mother, he spoke words that would remain forever etched in her memory. "I am offering all my sufferings to the Lord for sinners and for those who do not believe in him." These were not memorized phrases or empty repetitions. They flowed from a deep conviction shaped by years of authentic devotion. His prayers in the hospital became moments of intense spirituality, where he spoke to Jesus as if with a close friend visiting him in that hospital room. Other patients in the pediatric ward often asked to stay near Carlo, drawn by a peace that seemed to radiate from him in the midst of pain and uncertainty. Even when his own suffering became nearly unbearable, he found the strength to comfort others who were more desperate than himself. To Carlo, every stab of pain was a prayer offered for the eternal salvation of souls he had never even met. His spiritual maturity in facing his own mortality left everyone around him in awe. It wasn't the passive resignation of someone giving up, but the serene acceptance of one who knew there was a greater plan unfolding through his suffering. During long nights in the hospital, when his parents thought he was sleeping, Carlo remained in silent prayer, as if holding an intimate conversation with heaven. One night, his mother found him smiling alone in his room. When she asked why, he replied, "I'm thinking that soon I'll see Jesus face to face." There was no fear of death in his words, only a joyful anticipation, like a child waiting for Christmas. He spoke of eternity with the natural ease of someone describing an upcoming trip, showing an understanding of life after death that astonished even the most seasoned chaplains at the hospital. His Bible studies continued even during treatment, and he constantly asked to take part in the Eucharist whenever his health allowed. Carlo had developed an early awareness of his own passing, but instead of causing sadness, it gave him a serene joy that touched everyone around him. It was as if he already had one foot in heaven, living at once on earth and in eternity. Carlo's final days on earth were marked by a supernatural peace that defied any medical or psychological explanation. Even when the pain became almost unbearable, he never lost his composure or gave in to despair. The doctors and nurses caring for him often spoke among themselves, saying they had never witnessed such maturity and courage in the face of death. Carlo remained deeply concerned about the well-being of other patients, asking about their conditions and offering words of encouragement whenever he could. His final confession was a moment of profound emotion, where he reaffirmed his absolute faith in Jesus Christ and asked forgiveness for any fault he might have committed in his short life. In his last moments, surrounded by the unconditional love of his family, Carlo left this world with the same serenity that had marked his 15 years on earth. There was no prolonged agony, no unnecessary suffering. It was as though a pure soul had simply returned home. Even after his passing, the doctors were struck by the peace radiating from his face, as if a faint smile had been etched there. That teenager had turned a terminal illness into an extraordinary testimony of faith, proving that one can live and die with absolute dignity when the soul is certain of its eternal destiny. The death of Carlo Acutis on October 12, 2006, did not mark the end of his story, but the beginning of a spiritual legacy that would continue to touch thousands of lives around the world. His departure left a great emptiness in the hearts of those who knew him, yet it also planted seeds of faith that would soon blossom in extraordinary ways. News of his courage in the face of death spread quickly, first through the local Catholic community, then across the nation, and finally throughout the world. Priests began citing his example in sermons about facing suffering with faith, and groups of young Christians adopted his story as an inspiration to live a more authentic spirituality. What impressed people most was not simply that he had died young, but the heroic way he had transformed every moment of pain into an offering of love. His hospital room had become a small sanctuary, a place where other patients and families came seeking comfort and inspiration. The head nurse of the pediatric ward remarked that she had never witnessed a death so serene and filled with spiritual dignity. Carlo had proven that holiness is not reserved only for adults or for distant centuries. It can bloom at any age, especially when nourished by authentic faith and unconditional love for Jesus Christ. His early death became the spark for a series of extraordinary events that confirmed his heavenly intercession. The unshakable serenity he displayed throughout his battle with leukemia defied all logical or psychological explanation. While other teenagers in the same situation rebelled against their fate or questioned bitterly why this was happening, Carlo stood firm as a solid rock of peace in the storm. His calm was not forced or artificial. It flowed naturally from a faith deeply rooted through years of authentic devotion. During the most painful procedures, when needles pierced his veins already weakened by chemotherapy, he closed his eyes and whispered prayers as though speaking to a close friend. The doctors marveled at his ability to remain composed even during the most invasive exams, showing an emotional maturity that surpassed many adults. His breathing stayed steady, his face serene, and often a faint smile appeared on his lips even in the hardest moments. It was as though he carried within him a treasure no outside circumstance could disturb. This serenity was not resignation or passivity. It was the visible expression of absolute trust in God's goodness, even when circumstances seemed to suggest otherwise. What struck nurses, doctors, and fellow patients most was that Carlo was never heard complaining, even when the pain was almost unbearable. In the most intense crises, when other patients cried out in agony, he remained silent and contemplative, offering each stab of pain as a prayer. One nurse once told his mother, "In 15 years of working in pediatric oncology, I've never seen a child face pain with such dignity." When asked how he could endure so much suffering without complaint, Carlo gave a simple, disarming reply: "Jesus suffered far more for me on the cross." It was not a rehearsed answer, but one that sprang from a deep understanding of the redemptive meaning of Christian suffering. On the hardest nights, when the pain seemed endless, he would ask for a crucifix to be placed beside his bed so he could look at Jesus. His lips moved constantly in silent prayer, as if keeping an unbroken dialogue with heaven. The medical team began using his example to encourage other young patients, saying, "Look how Carlo faces all this with courage." His presence transformed the hospital atmosphere, bringing hope and faith into a place usually marked by anguish and despair. The most striking trait of Carlo's personality during his illness was his constant concern for others, even while he himself was suffering intensely. Where most would naturally turn inward to their own pain, he kept a genuine interest in the struggles of others. He asked about the conditions of fellow patients, encouraged children who were frightened, and often asked his parents to pray for families facing even greater hardships. During one of his longer hospital stays, he met an 8-year-old girl newly diagnosed with cancer who was completely terrified. Carlo spent hours with her, talking about the importance of faith, telling her stories of saints who had faced great trials, and teaching her little prayers she could say during medical procedures. His parents were moved to see him comforting other families in the corridors, sharing his own spiritual strength with people he hardly knew. Whenever he received gifts or cards of encouragement, his first thought was to share them with patients who seemed lonelier or in greater need of attention. This generosity was not planned or deliberate. It flowed naturally from a heart that had learned to love as Christ loves. In his final moments, Carlo continued to radiate a joy that words could not explain, a joy that spread quietly to all who stood near him. It was not the artificial euphoria of someone trying to hide fear, but a deep and quiet joy that sprang from absolute certainty about his eternal destiny. In his final days, when he already knew his departure was near, he comforted his own parents, telling them not to be sad because soon they would all be together again in heaven. In a conversation with his mother just days before he died, he said something that would remain forever etched in her memory: "Do not cry for me when I go. I will be very happy because I will finally see Jesus face to face." His last words were words of gratitude. He thanked the doctors, the nurses, the chaplains, and especially his parents for the unconditional love he had received. Even when he could no longer speak clearly because of the medication, his eyes still shone with a special light that left everyone present deeply moved. The nurse on duty during his final hours later said she had never witnessed a death so peaceful and filled with spiritual dignity. Carlo had transformed even the moment of death into a testimony of faith, proving that it is possible to leave this life with joy when one is certain of eternal life. His unshakable trust in God remained intact until his very last breath, inspiring all who witnessed his final journey. The heroic way Carlo faced suffering reached far beyond the walls of the hospital and began inspiring people across the world. Doctors and nurses who had cared for him started sharing his story with other patients, using his example as a source of hope and courage. Families facing similar trials wanted to know more about how this young boy had managed to hold on to faith in such harsh circumstances. Priests began including his testimony in their homilies on the Christian meaning of suffering, showing how pain can be transformed into an offering of love. Prayer groups began forming on their own, asking for his intercession for other young people battling serious illnesses. His story spread through testimonies of faith, shared in worship services, youth gatherings, and Bible studies dedicated to the theme of hope in the midst of trials. What impressed people most was not just his individual courage, but the way he managed to stay focused on eternity even when surrounded by the cruel reality of an early death. Carlo had proven that true strength does not come from muscles or youth, but from a solid faith that stands firm even when everything around seems to be collapsing. His example would echo through the decades, inspiring countless people to carry their own crosses with the same dignity and hope he had shown. Only a few months after Carlo's death, extraordinary reports began to emerge from around the world of people claiming to have received special graces through his heavenly intercession. The first documented case involved a Brazilian child diagnosed with a severe malformation of the pancreas, a condition doctors considered incurable and potentially fatal. The parents, desperate and out of medical options, began a novena asking for Carlo Acutis' intercession, even though he had not yet been officially recognized as blessed by the Church. For 9 consecutive days, the whole family gathered in prayer, asking that this young saint intercede for their son before Christ. On the 9th day, something unexplainable happened. Medical tests showed a sudden and complete healing of the child's condition, leaving doctors utterly baffled. There was no scientific explanation for such an instant cure, and the specialists officially declared it a phenomenon that defied all medical logic. This first miracle would later be rigorously investigated by the Catholic Church and would become the foundation for Carlo's beatification process. The Brazilian family became key witnesses to the powerful intercession of this young man who had left the world so early. Another striking case involved an Italian couple who had tried to conceive for more than 10 years without success, enduring multiple fertility treatments with no positive outcome. After learning about Carlo Acutis through a sermon in their local parish, they decided to ask for his intercession so they might have a child. It was not a desperate or superstitious request. It was a heartfelt prayer made in genuine faith in the communion of saints and in Carlo's ability to intercede for them in heaven. For months they remained steadfast in their devotion, visiting his tomb in Assisi regularly and praying the rosary each day, asking for his help. To the astonishment of everyone, including their doctors, the wife became pregnant naturally after a decade of failed attempts. Fertility specialists who knew their medical history said that, from a medical standpoint, such a pregnancy was nearly impossible in their circumstances. The baby was born perfectly healthy, and the parents credited this miracle to the powerful intercession of Carlo Acutis. This case, along with many others like it, began to establish Carlo's reputation as a particularly effective intercessor for matters concerning family and health. The story spread quickly throughout the Catholic community in Italy and then internationally, deepening devotion to this young saint. The dreams and signs experienced by Antonia, Carlo's mother, became a constant source of comfort and confirmation that her son remained spiritually present in the life of the family. Just weeks after his death, she began having extraordinarily vivid dreams in which Carlo appeared radiant with joy, dressed in bright white garments and surrounded by a soft yet brilliant light. In these encounters, he consoled his mother, telling her that he was very happy in heaven and would continue caring for the family from there. What struck Antonia most was the clarity of these dreams. They did not feel like products of her imagination or her grief, but real spiritual encounters in which she could talk with her son about practical matters of family life. In one of these visions, Carlo gave her guidance on important decisions regarding the preservation of his memory and the work of evangelization she should carry on. In another memorable dream, he appeared alongside other young saints, especially Saint Gemma Galgani, confirming his place within the communion of saints. These signs were not just personal consolations, they became powerful testimonies that Antonia shared in conferences and faith gatherings around the world. The simplicity with which she recounted these experiences, without exaggeration or seeking attention, gave credibility to her witness and strengthened the faith of thousands who listened. One of the most extraordinary events linked to Carlo's intercession was the birth of twins to a family who had lost a son under circumstances similar to his. The parents, devastated by the death of their teenage son from cancer, had lost all hope of ever finding joy again. At their son's funeral, they learned about the story of Carlo Acutis from a priest who spoke of how this young boy had faced the same illness with heroic faith. Moved by the serenity of the Acutis family in the face of a similar tragedy, they began asking for Carlo's intercession so they might find peace amid their crushing grief. Months later, they unexpectedly discovered they were expecting twins, something they had thought impossible, given the mother's advanced age and the fragile emotional state they were in. Throughout the pregnancy, they felt a special presence watching over both the mother and the babies, and they attributed this protection to Carlo's intercession. The twins were born healthy on October 12th, the very day of Carlo Acutis's passing, which the family took as an unmistakable sign of his heavenly care. This became one of the most moving testimonies of Carlo's ability to turn tragedy into blessing, proving that his mission of bringing hope to families continued even after his death. The striking coincidence did not go unnoticed by the Catholic community, who saw in that birth a clear sign of divine approval for the growing devotion to this young saint. As these accounts multiplied, spreading across social networks, parishes, and faith gatherings, Carlo's reputation for holiness grew rapidly around the world. People from many nations began organizing prayer groups dedicated to seeking his intercession, and his tomb in Assisi gradually became an international place of pilgrimage. What impressed the Church's investigators most was the consistency and seriousness of the testimonies. These were not fanciful or exaggerated stories, but sober, well-documented accounts from reliable people who had experienced extraordinary graces. Skeptical doctors began acknowledging that some healings had no plausible scientific explanation, and several were willing to testify officially about the mysterious recoveries they had witnessed. Entire families reshaped their spiritual lives after receiving graces through Carlo's intercession, becoming more engaged in worship, adopting stronger devotional practices, and sharing their renewed faith with others. The Catholic Church, always cautious when dealing with reports of the supernatural, began strict investigations into the most striking cases, following rigorous scientific protocols to verify their authenticity. These extraordinary signs were not seen as mere curiosities, but as a foundation for officially recognizing Carlo as a powerful intercessor and a true saint for our times. One of the most remarkable discoveries, which left a deep impact on the entire scientific community, came years after Carlo's death, during the process of beatification. Following the Church's careful protocols for verifying possible signs of sanctity, a team of forensic specialists and medical examiners opened his casket, expecting to find only bones, as would be normal after so many years in the ground. To everyone's astonishment, Carlo's body was found almost perfectly preserved, with skin, hair, and nails intact in a way that defied all conventional scientific explanations. At first skeptical, the specialists carried out multiple tests in an effort to find a natural cause for the phenomenon. Yet there was no trace of special embalming, nor any chemicals that could explain such preservation after years of ordinary burial conditions. The temperature, humidity, and other environmental factors of the tomb were entirely normal, with nothing unusual that could account for it. Experts in thanatology officially declared that what they witnessed was scientifically inexplicable, unlike anything they had encountered in decades of professional work. This finding not only confirmed suspicions of Carlo's holiness but also offered tangible, physical evidence that something truly supernatural was unfolding around this extraordinary young man. Carlo's mother, Antonia Salzano, faced the most devastating loss any mother can endure, yet her response to that tragedy became a living witness to how faith can transform even the deepest pain into a source of hope and evangelization. Drawing inspiration from the biblical book of Job, she came to understand that her suffering was not divine punishment but a share in God's greater plan for the salvation of souls. In the first months after Carlo's death, Antonia went through an intense inner process of acceptance, searching through prayer and scripture study for the spiritual meaning of such a premature loss. It was neither easy nor quick. There were moments of anger, deep questioning, and nights of endless tears. But gradually, strengthened by the solid faith she had cultivated over years of authentic Christian living, she began to see her son's death not as the end of a story, but as the beginning of an even greater mission of evangelization. She came to believe that Carlo's sacrifice had been accepted by God as part of His will for the salvation of many souls around the world. This understanding did not erase her pain as a mother, but gave meaning and purpose to her loss. Her spiritual transformation was so profound that she became one of the main witnesses of her son's holiness, traveling across the world to share his story and inspire other families facing similar trials. The Acutis family's journey became a living testimony to the world that authentic Christian faith can be lived even in the harshest circumstances. Antonia began receiving invitations from parishes, dioceses, and Catholic movements worldwide to speak about her son's story and how faith sustained her family through that extreme trial. Her talks were not merely emotional narratives but true catecheses on the Christian meaning of suffering, the importance of the sacraments, and the reality of the communion of saints. In her conferences, she spoke naturally about the extraordinary signs she had experienced, the dreams in which Carlo appeared to comfort her, and the miracles that began through his intercession. What struck audiences most was not just the content of her testimony, but the serenity and joy she radiated as she spoke about experiences that could have crushed anyone else. Her presence at worship services, retreats, and youth gatherings often led to deep conversions and renewed faith among people who had lost hope. Many parents grieving the loss of children found in her example the strength they needed to keep living and to hold on to their faith in God. Antonia showed that a mother's witness of faith can be one of the most powerful forms of evangelization, touching hearts and changing lives around the globe. Carlo's tomb in Assisi quickly grew from a simple burial site into a true sanctuary, where thousands of pilgrims came seeking inspiration, comfort, and intercession. From the earliest months after his passing, people from all over the world brought flowers, letters, prayers, and moving testimonies of graces received. The cemetery administration had to reorganize the area around his tomb to handle the growing flow of visitors arriving daily. And it wasn't only Italians. Families came from Brazil, Argentina, the United States, the Philippines, and dozens of other countries, often spending years of savings to make that special pilgrimage. The tomb was covered with ex-votos, photographs of healed people, toys left by grateful children, and thousands of handwritten requests for intercession in many languages. Groups of young Christians organized trips just to visit the place where their model of modern holiness was laid to rest. On weekends and holy days, long lines formed as pilgrims waited for the chance to spend a few minutes in silent prayer before the tomb. Local priests remarked that they had never seen popular devotion grow so quickly or so spontaneously. The economic impact on the town of Assisi was notable, but the spiritual impact was even greater, transforming that corner of Italy into a center of evangelization that drew people from across the globe. What impressed so many who encountered the Acutis family story was how they had managed to transform personal tragedy into a source of hope and inspiration for millions. It was not passive acceptance or melancholy resignation, but a deep understanding of the Christian mystery of the cross and resurrection, lived out in the most concrete way. In interviews with journalists worldwide, Antonia often stressed that Carlo's holiness was not something exceptional meant only for him, but a universal call that all young Christians could embrace in their own lives. Her testimony carried special weight with parents struggling with teenagers, showing them that raising saints is possible even in today's world filled with distractions and temptations. The way she spoke about religion, spirituality, and devotion never felt outdated or disconnected from modern life. Rather, it revealed how authentic faith can be lived naturally and joyfully in the 21st century. Catholic movements worldwide began incorporating the Acutis family's example into their programs, particularly in seminars on family ministry and youth evangelization. Their witness proved that authentic Christian families can be the most powerful instruments of evangelization, turning their lived faith into bridges that connect others to Jesus Christ.